When Elena, a successful black woman, disguises herself as a maid in her wealthy white fiancé's family home, she uncovers unsettling truths about their deeply ingrained prejudices. As the web of deception tightens, she must decide whether love can truly conquer silent racism, or whether it's time to walk away from the man she loves, no matter the cost. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Elena stood at the edge of the sprawling estate, her heart pounding as she looked up at the massive iron gates. She was both anxious and determined. The mansion beyond represented her future with David, a world of wealth and privilege that felt worlds apart from her own upbringing. She loved David deeply, but Elena couldn't ignore the nagging fear that his family might harbor deep-rooted biases. So she decided to test their true nature in an unconventional way by disguising herself as a maid named Maya to work in their home. Dressed in plain clothes and with her hair pulled back, Elena hardly recognized herself in the reflection of the polished gate. But she pressed forward, knowing this was the only way to see David's family for who they really were. The butler, George, opened the gate with a disinterested glance. He barely made eye contact as he guided Elena inside. The mansion's grandeur was overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, marble floors gleamed beneath her feet, and priceless paintings adorned the walls. Elena reminded herself to focus. This was no time to be impressed by wealth. She had a mission. Vivian, David's mother, was the first family member she encountered. Tall and immaculately dressed, Vivian's eyes were piercing, her expression one of quiet judgment. "You must be the new maid," Vivian said coolly. "We expect the highest standards here, Maya. I hope you understand that." "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied humbly, bowing her head slightly. It was odd to respond so submissively, but she was committed to the role. Vivian immediately assigned Elena a list of tasks: cleaning, cooking, and tending to various rooms throughout the day. It was clear that Vivian enjoyed wielding her authority. Watching Elena work with a scrutinizing gaze, Elena could feel the subtle shift in Vivian's tone when addressing her versus the other, mostly white staff. There was a sense of entitlement, as if Elena's presence was less than welcome. David, meanwhile, had no idea what his fiancée was enduring. He was away on a business trip and remained unaware of Elena's plan to disguise herself as Maya. Elena felt a pang of guilt for deceiving him, but she reminded herself of her goal. To understand the true dynamics of his family, love was on the line, and Elena needed clarity. The days were long and tiring. The microaggressions started early. One morning as Elena cleaned the kitchen counters, Rebecca, David's younger sister, wandered in. Rebecca's gaze lingered on Elena's hair, a mix of curiosity and condescension. "Your hair is so different," Rebecca said, her voice almost childlike. "I've never seen it like that up close. Do you do it yourself?" Elena nodded, forcing a smile. "Yes, I do." The interactions were laced with a kind of casual racism that Elena had encountered before, but never from people who were supposed to be her future in-laws. It was painful, but also eye-opening. Despite the difficulties, Elena remained determined. She spent her nights writing notes in a small journal, recording every conversation, every side glance, and every offhand comment. It was exhausting, but Elena knew it was necessary. This was the only way she could know whether her love for David could truly survive. Her initial observations were enough to convince her that David's family was far from accepting. But the worst was yet to come. One evening, Elena overheard a conversation between Vivian and Richard, David's father. They were in the study, and their voices were low but audible enough. "It's just a phase," Richard was saying, referring to David's relationship with Elena. "They'll get tired of the novelty soon enough," Vivian chuckled. "Yes, she's certainly exotic, but can you imagine introducing her to our friends?" Elena felt tears welling up, but she refused to cry. This was the truth she needed, even if it hurt. She couldn't confront them yet. She needed more evidence before deciding her next steps. As the weeks passed, Elena's interactions with other staff members revealed even more about the family's prejudiced views. One maid, Anna, a young Latina woman, confided in Elena about the constant dismissive treatment she faced. "They act like we're invisible," Anna whispered. "Just part of the furniture." Elena's heart broke at the familiarity of Anna's words. This family, with all its wealth and status, was no different from others who used privilege as a shield against empathy. But Elena wasn't ready to give up yet. There was still David, the man she loved deeply, who seemed to be different from the rest of his family. But was he? The question haunted Elena as she continued her charade. She knew that the truth was messy, that love alone might not be enough to overcome the systemic biases she was witnessing firsthand. Yet she held on to hope, determined to believe that David could rise above the prejudices of his upbringing. As Elena finished her chores one evening, she stood by a window and watched the sun set over the manicured gardens. She wondered what David would think if he knew what she had uncovered so far. Would he be shocked? Would he deny it? Or would he finally confront the biases he had been raised with? The deception was taking its toll, but Elena's resolve remained unbroken. She would stay the course, no matter how painful it became. The test she had set in motion was not just for David's family. It was also a test of her own strength, resilience, and the depth of her love. Elena knew that she was nearing a breaking point, but the truth was still out of reach. She had to dig deeper, endure more, and find a way to bring the real face of this family to light. Only then could she decide whether her love for David was strong enough to overcome everything she had discovered. The second week of Elena's undercover journey felt even more draining than the first. As she settled into her routine, she found herself growing more attuned to the subtle nuances of the family's attitudes. The harsh reality of her experiment was that it wasn't just about the overtly prejudiced comments. It was also about the small, daily interactions that betrayed deeply ingrained biases. One morning, while dusting a bookshelf in the lavish living room, Elena overheard a conversation between Vivian and Rebecca. They were discussing plans for an upcoming charity gala, and Vivian's voice was laced with pride. "We've always donated generously to causes," she remarked, her tone almost defensive, "even the ones for underprivileged minorities." Rebecca nodded absent-mindedly. "Yes, but you know how it is, Mother. People love to play the victim card these days." Elena's hands froze midair, and she clenched the dusting cloth in frustration. The comment was delivered so casually, as if it was an ordinary truth. This was not a moment of blatant hatred, but rather one of subtle, dismissive prejudice that spoke volumes about how the family viewed people like Elena. Later that afternoon, while preparing lunch, Elena had a chance to interact with Clara, the wise, older maid who had become a beacon of warmth in the otherwise cold mansion. Clara's presence was a quiet but powerful reminder of resilience. Clara had been working for the family for over 2 decades, a fact that impressed Elena but also made her curious about what kept Clara here. "Why do you stay?" Elena asked Clara quietly while they were alone in the kitchen, washing dishes together. Clara wiped her hands on her apron and sighed. "I stay because it's all I've known, child. I've seen things change, but not always for the better. This family pays well, but they don't see us as people." Elena's heart ached at Clara's words. It was the kind of painful truth she had expected to find, but hearing it spoken aloud added a new layer of gravity to her mission. Clara's strength was admirable, but Elena also saw the cost of enduring such prejudice for so long. Over the next few days, the prejudice Elena witnessed began to wear on her more deeply. Vivian's remarks became sharper, her gaze more critical. Vivian had noticed Elena's intelligence and sometimes engaged her in conversation, but always with a hint of superiority. "You speak quite well for someone who hasn't had formal education, Maya," Vivian commented one evening. Elena fought to maintain her composure. "Thank you, ma'am," she replied simply, knowing it wasn't the time to reveal her true background. Meanwhile, Elena had started to overhear more troubling conversations between Vivian and Richard. The more she heard, the clearer it became that David's parents viewed people like Elena as fundamentally different, almost as if they belonged to another species. One conversation struck a particularly painful chord. "It's a shame, really," Vivian said to Richard one evening while Elena was serving dinner. "David's gotten too involved with that woman. I thought it would be a fling, but he's serious. What will people think?" Richard, sipping his wine, replied nonchalantly, "Let him have his fun. He'll come back to his senses. The right kind of woman won't have him dealing with complicated issues." Alina's face remained impassive as she placed a platter on the table, but inside, her emotions churned. She wanted to scream, to demand to be seen as more than just a complication. But she remained silent, knowing that this revelation was a crucial part of the test she had set for herself. Her nights were filled with restless thoughts. She had never anticipated just how hard it would be to remain passive while hearing such hurtful things. As Maya, she was invisible to the family, and that invisibility was a constant reminder of her otherness. Yet, she couldn't let her frustration or pain derail her mission. There was still more to learn, more to expose. It wasn't just David's parents who disappointed Alina. Rebecca, whom Alina had initially perceived as kinder, revealed her own biases in subtle but undeniable ways. One day, as Alina cleared away plates after a lunch meeting with some of Rebecca's friends, she overheard their conversation. "I can't believe David is still with her," one of Rebecca's friends whispered. "I thought he'd end it by now." Rebecca shrugged. "Who knows? Maybe he's going through some phase. But you know how these relationships end. Sooner or later, they always go back to where they belong." Alina's hands trembled as she picked up the plates. It was becoming increasingly clear that even Rebecca, who occasionally showed Alina small gestures of kindness, was shaped by the same prejudiced worldview as the rest of her family. It wasn't hatred, at least, not overtly. It was a kind of casual dismissal, a refusal to truly see Alina as a person equal to them. But amidst the growing sense of despair, there was one person who made things slightly more bearable. David's younger cousin, Lily. Unlike the others, Lily seemed genuinely interested in getting to know Alina, or rather, Maya. She often sat in the kitchen while Alina worked, asking about her life with genuine curiosity. "What's your story, Maya?" Lily asked one day. "How did you end up here?" Alina hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal without compromising her identity. "I came here looking for work," she replied, keeping it vague. "Sometimes you have to take risks to find the truth." Lily seemed to sense a deeper meaning in Alina's words. "That's brave," she said softly. "Most people wouldn't have the courage to step into a world that isn't theirs." Alina was touched by Lily's words, but they also highlighted the stark contrast between her and the rest of the family. Lily's kindness was a small light in an otherwise dark environment, but it wasn't enough to change the reality of the situation. As the days wore on, Alina felt the weight of her deception more acutely. She wanted to confront David's family, to reveal her true identity, and challenge their biases head-on. But she wasn't sure how David would react. Would he stand by her, or would he be unable to overcome the deeply ingrained beliefs of his family? The uncertainty was suffocating. Alina knew that her mission was nearing a critical juncture, but she still needed to witness more, to be absolutely certain of what she was facing. Only then could she decide whether to confront David's family openly or to leave quietly, knowing the truth but unable to change it. Each day felt like a balancing act, with Alina trying to maintain her role as Maya while also struggling with her feelings for David. She still loved him deeply, but she was starting to see the chasm that lay between them, one built by years of privilege, ignorance, and silent complicity. As the chapter drew to a close, Alina found herself standing at a crossroads, both literally and figuratively. She was still inside the mansion, still undercover, but her resolve was beginning to waver. The truth was more painful than she had anticipated, and the question of whether love could truly conquer prejudice loomed larger than ever before. By the start of the third week, Alina's emotional fatigue began to morph into a deeper sense of clarity. Every morning, as she tied on her apron and prepared for another day in the mansion, she felt more certain about the growing divide between her values and the reality of David's family. However, she wasn't ready to confront them just yet. There were still unanswered questions about David himself. How complicit was he in these biases? Could love really bridge the gap between them? Her doubts about David began to mount, especially after he unexpectedly returned home from his business trip. Alina's heart raced when she saw him in the mansion's hallway. He had no idea she was right there, hidden in plain sight as Maya, and he greeted the household staff with casual indifference. The warmth she knew in private moments between them was absent, replaced by a distant politeness. In the days following his return, Alina observed David closely, but from a distance. He seemed at ease in his family's world, laughing at jokes that hinted at stereotypes and indulging in the unspoken superiority that permeated the household. One particular evening, he was talking to Vivian and Rebecca in the dining room. "You know, David," Vivian said with a sly smile, "I'm glad you're back. I was beginning to think you were spending too much time in a different environment." David laughed lightly, his tone attempting to be dismissive. "Well, I still love you guys, even if I'm broadening my horizons a bit." Alina felt a pang of anger and hurt. His response was playful, almost as if he was appeasing his family's prejudices while avoiding conflict. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about how deeply ingrained his need to fit into his family's mold really was. That night, as Elena sat alone in her small room, she reflected on what she had seen. She had always thought of David as someone who stood apart from his family's biases, a man capable of love beyond racial barriers. But seeing him laugh along, even if uneasily, with jokes that reduced people like her to stereotypes, made her question whether he was truly willing to challenge his privilege, or if he was simply comfortable within it. But Elena still held on to hope. Her love for David wasn't easily shaken, despite the mounting evidence against him. Perhaps he was simply trying to navigate a difficult family dynamic, trying to keep the peace while still loving her in his own way. Yet, the fact remained that David's silence in the face of prejudice was beginning to feel like a betrayal of their love. One afternoon, Elena had an unexpected opportunity to interact with David directly, albeit in her role as Maya. She was cleaning the living room when David entered, seemingly lost in thought. He barely glanced at Elena as he took a seat on the couch, scrolling through his phone. But then something unusual happened. He looked up and spoke to her. "Maya, could you get me a glass of water, please?" he asked, his voice polite but distant. Elena felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Here she was, face to face with the man she loved, who didn't even recognize her. As she handed him the glass, David thanked her with a smile that felt both familiar and foreign. It was a surreal moment. David's kindness was real, but it was also superficial, grounded in a dynamic that made Elena feel invisible. "Thank you, Maya," he repeated, as if emphasizing her role, not knowing that she was the woman he claimed to love. Elena forced a smile and nodded, her heart heavy with the irony of the situation. As the days passed, Elena's bond with Clara grew stronger. Clara sensed Elena's inner turmoil, even if she didn't know the full truth of her mission. One evening, as they were cleaning the kitchen together, Clara looked at Elena with a mixture of empathy and warning. "You care for him, don't you?" Clara asked quietly. Elena paused, surprised by the question. She hesitated before nodding. "Yes, I do. But it's complicated." Clara sighed deeply. "Love is always complicated, child, but you have to ask yourself if it's worth the price. The kind of love you want shouldn't come with conditions, especially not ones that compromise your dignity." Elena felt tears prick at her eyes. Clara's words were a stark reminder of the emotional cost of her situation. She had entered the mansion to uncover the truth, but now that she had seen it, the question of whether love could overcome prejudice felt more daunting than ever. Her doubts reached a breaking point during a family gathering one evening. Vivian had invited several family friends over for a dinner party, and Elena was assigned to serve drinks. The guests were well-dressed, polished, and overwhelmingly white. The conversations were filled with polite small talk, but the undertones were unmistakable. As Elena approached the group to refill their wine glasses, she overheard one of the guests, an older woman, make a comment that sent chills down her spine. "Well, you know how it is," the woman said. "Certain people just don't have the same values as us. It's not their fault, of course. It's just cultural differences." Vivian nodded in agreement, her voice dripping with condescension. "Exactly. That's why we have to be careful who we let into our circles, even if it's just for appearances." Elena's grip tightened around the wine bottle, her anger barely contained. She wanted to scream, to reveal her true identity right there and challenge the hypocrisy head-on. But she knew that doing so would be premature. She still needed to confront David privately, to give him a chance to redeem himself and prove that he was not like his family. The opportunity came sooner than expected. The following day, while David was alone in the study, Elena took a deep breath and decided to approach him. She had to find out whether he was truly aware of his family's biases, or if he was complicit in them. "Excuse me, sir," Elena said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. David looked up, surprised. "Yes, Maya? What is it?" Elena hesitated for a moment, then spoke with as much sincerity as she could muster. "Do you ever feel like people here don't really see others for who they are?" David seemed taken aback by the question. "What do you mean?" Elena struggled to find the right words. "I mean, it feels like people here judge others based on where they come from, rather than who they are as individuals." David frowned, as if the question made him uncomfortable. "Well, that's just how some people are," he said, sounding almost dismissive. "It's not ideal, but it's not really something I can change." Elena's heart sank. His response, though polite, was filled with indifference. He seemed resigned to the reality of his family's prejudice, rather than motivated to challenge it. She walked away from the conversation, feeling more disheartened than ever. It wasn't that David didn't care, he simply didn't seem to understand the full impact of his family's biases or the silent harm his inaction caused. For Elena, this was the most painful realization of all. As the chapter drew to a close, Elena found herself standing alone in the mansion's garden, looking up at the night sky. Her love for David was still there, but it felt fragile, almost like a dream that couldn't survive in the harsh light of reality. She knew that the time for confrontation was near, but she wasn't sure if she was ready for what it would reveal. The cracks in her love and loyalty were becoming more visible, and Elena realized that the truth might not only destroy her relationship with David, it might also force her to reevaluate her own capacity for forgiveness. The fourth week of Elena's undercover mission arrived, bringing with it a sense of urgency she could no longer ignore. The oppressive weight of the family's prejudice, coupled with David's passive acceptance of it, had become unbearable. Every day spent as Maya felt like a betrayal of her true self, but Elena knew she needed one final confrontation, one that would determine not just the future of her relationship with David, but also her own dignity. It happened on a Friday evening. The family was hosting a dinner party with some of their closest friends. As the house buzzed with preparations, Elena could feel tension simmering beneath her calm exterior. She was tired of being invisible, tired of being treated as less than. Tonight, she would reveal her true identity, no matter the consequences. The dining room was filled with the sound of clinking glasses, laughter, and the soft hum of conversation. Elena moved among the guests, serving drinks and clearing plates. Her mind was racing, but she maintained a professional demeanor. David was there too, looking handsome and charming as ever. He laughed with the guests, occasionally glancing in Elena's direction without recognizing her. The turning point came when one of the guests, a distinguished older man, decided to make a remark that was both condescending and overtly racist. "I've always said," he began with a smug smile, "that charity is best done from a distance. You can't really change the nature of certain people, no matter how much you try." The room erupted in polite chuckles, with Vivian nodding approvingly. "Yes, it's a difficult truth, but a necessary one," she agreed. Elena's heart pounded in her chest. The moment had arrived. She could no longer stay silent. She put down the tray she was carrying and stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Excuse me, but I have something to say." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to her. David looked confused, as if trying to place her face. Vivian's expression shifted from surprise to annoyance, while Richard simply looked intrigued. Elena took a deep breath, feeling a rush of adrenaline. "I am not who you think I am," she declared. "My name is Elena, and I am the woman David is engaged to. I came here as Maya to see how this family truly treats people who don't come from privilege." David's face turned pale, his eyes wide with shock. "Elena?" he stammered, his voice barely audible. Vivian's reaction was immediate and fierce. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice sharp and filled with anger. "This is deception." Elena met Vivian's gaze head-on, her own voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yes, it is," she admitted. "But it's no different from the deception I've faced every day in this house. I needed to know if this family was truly capable of accepting me, not just as David's fiancé, but as a person of color, and what I've discovered is heartbreaking." David seemed frozen, unable to speak. His confusion was evident, but so was his guilt. Elena turned to him, her eyes filled with pain. I loved you, David. I still do. But I needed to see if you were willing to stand up against the prejudice that's so deeply rooted in your family. Instead, I found you laughing along, pretending it wasn't there. David finally found his voice, his tone a mix of desperation and disbelief. Elena, I didn't know. I didn't realize. You didn't want to realize, Elena interrupted, her voice breaking slightly. You wanted to believe that love alone could erase the ugliness around us. But love doesn't work that way. It takes courage and it takes action. Vivian's face was a mask of indignation. This is outrageous, she said coldly. You had no right to deceive us like this. Elena turned back to Vivian, her expression one of quiet defiance. No, Mrs. Bennet, you had no right to judge me without knowing who I am. I came here to test your acceptance, but all I found were walls built by prejudice and privilege. The room was silent, the guests unsure of how to react. Richard, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up, his tone surprisingly calm. So, what happens now? You've revealed your true identity. What's your next move? Elena looked directly at him, her voice filled with resolve. My next move depends on David, she said simply. He has to decide whether he's willing to confront the biases of his family or whether he's content to be a silent witness. David looked torn, his face a mix of regret and confusion. I love you, Elena, he said quietly. I never wanted to hurt you, but this is a lot to process. Elena's eyes softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. Love isn't enough, David, not if it comes at the cost of my dignity. I need you to understand what I've faced, not just here, but in life. I need you to be more than just a bystander. Vivian's voice cut in, filled with icy disdain. You expect us to change overnight? You think one dramatic revelation will make us different people? No, Elena replied, her voice calm but strong. I don't expect that, but I do expect you to understand that your words and actions have real consequences. You can choose to learn, to be better, or you can choose to stay the same. The choice is yours. David's eyes filled with tears. Elena, please, give me a chance. I didn't know how deep this ran. Elena's expression was filled with a mixture of love and sadness. I want to believe you, David. I really do. But you have to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. The room remained silent, the weight of Elena's words hanging heavily in the air. The guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure of whether to stay or leave. Vivian, however, was not ready to back down. This is still our home, she said coldly. And you are still a guest, no matter what name you use. Elena looked around the room, her eyes filled with both defiance and vulnerability. I'm not here to change you, she said quietly. I'm here to stand up for myself. With that, she turned and walked out of the dining room, her steps steady and unyielding. David made a move to follow her, but then stopped, as if unsure of what to do. Outside in the garden, Elena finally let the tears fall. She had known this confrontation would be painful, but she hadn't expected it to hurt so much. She loved David deeply, but she also knew that her self-respect was more important than any relationship. David eventually found her outside, his face pale and filled with regret. Elena, please, I'm sorry. I know I've been blind, but I want to change. I want to be better for you, for us. Elena's heart ached at his words, but she also knew that promises alone wouldn't be enough. I hope you mean that, David, she said softly, but I can't wait forever. You need to show me, not just tell me. David nodded, tears in his eyes. I will, he vowed. I'll prove it. Elena gave him a small, sad smile. I hope you do, she said. But for now, I need to leave. I need to find myself again, away from this house and its prejudices. David's face fell, but he didn't argue. He seemed to understand at last that Elena's journey was one she had to make alone. As Elena walked away from the mansion that had been both a testing ground and a battlefield, she felt a strange mix of sadness and liberation. She had faced the truth, and she had stood up for herself, even in the face of love. The emotional confrontation was over, but the consequences of it were only beginning. As Elena left the mansion that night, the air felt both colder and clearer. Her heart was heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired, but there was also a sense of liberation that accompanied the decision to stand up for herself. She hadn't anticipated how devastating it would be to confront David and his family, but she knew she had done the right thing. There were no illusions left, only the raw truth. The following days were marked by a quiet solitude. Elena stayed with a close friend, a safe haven far from the mansion's judgmental walls. She avoided calls and messages, needing space to process everything that had unfolded. Her friend, Sophia, a strong and supportive figure in Elena's life, offered her a comforting shoulder. "Are you okay?" Sophia asked gently one evening as they sat together on the balcony, the stars twinkling above them. Elena sighed deeply, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know yet. I feel sad but also relieved. It's strange." Sophia nodded, understanding. "You did something incredibly brave, Elena. You stood up for yourself. Not many people can do that, especially when love is involved." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I loved him, Soph. I still do. But I also love myself, and that's why I had to walk away." As the days passed, David's messages became more desperate. He called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to pleading. "Elena, please. I know I messed up, but I want to change. I'll do anything to make this right," one message said. Despite her heartache, Elena needed time. She couldn't return to a relationship that had been built on silent acceptance of prejudice. It wasn't just about David's words. It was about his actions. She needed to see if he could truly change, not just for her, but for himself. 1 week after her departure, David finally managed to meet with Elena in person. He arrived at Sophia's apartment, looking tired and disheveled, an unusual sight for someone who had always been impeccably groomed. His eyes were filled with a mix of sorrow and determination. "Elena," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "I know I failed you. I failed us. But I've started seeing things differently now. I've been talking to Clara, learning about what you experienced, and trying to understand the privilege I've taken for granted." Elena listened, her expression guarded, but hopeful. "What did you learn, David? What did you really see?" David's gaze was earnest. "I saw how deeply rooted my family's biases are. I saw how much pain they've caused, not just to you, but to people like Clara, who have worked for them for years without being truly seen. I realized that I've been complicit in their prejudice, even if unintentionally." His words were sincere, but Elena remained cautious. "I appreciate that, David, but acknowledging it is only the first step. You have to actively fight against it. You have to choose to be different, consistently." David nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "I know. I've already started making changes. I spoke to my parents, told them how wrong they were, and how I won't tolerate their views anymore. I'm also working with a local organization that supports racial equality. It's small, but it's a start." Elena felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps David was truly changing, but she needed more than words. "I want to believe you, David," she said softly. "But this isn't just about us. It's about dismantling a system of prejudice, and that takes time. It takes work, real, hard work." David's voice broke slightly as he spoke. "I know, Elena, and I'm willing to do it. I don't want to lose you, but I also want to be a better man for myself as well." Tears filled Elena's eyes as she reached for David's hand. "I want you to be that man too, David, but I need to see real change, consistent change. Love can't survive if it's surrounded by hate, even if that hate is silent." David nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. "I'll prove it to you, Elena. I'll prove it every day whether you're with me or not." Elena's heart ached at the sincerity in his eyes. "I'm not giving up on you, David," she said softly, "but I need to heal. I need to find myself again." David accepted her words, knowing that the path ahead would be challenging. "I'll be here," he promised, "whenever you're ready." With that, they parted ways, not as strangers, but as two people who had shared a deep love and a painful awakening. Elena didn't know if their love would survive, but she knew that she had made the right choice. She had stood up for herself, demanded change, and refused to accept anything less than equality. Over the next few months, Elena focused on her own growth. She resumed her career, became involved in advocacy work, and found strength in her identity. She reconnected with her roots, embracing the parts of herself that had been stifled by the need to fit into David's world. It was a journey of self-discovery, filled with both pain and empowerment. Meanwhile, David continued to work on himself. He remained active in the local organization, educating himself about systemic racism and using his privilege to support marginalized communities. He wrote to Elena occasionally, updating her on his progress. His words were filled with sincerity, but Alina maintained a cautious distance, knowing that time was the ultimate test. One day, nearly 6 months after their separation, David reached out again. This time, it was different. His message was simple but heartfelt. "I've learned so much and I've changed. But whether you choose to come back or not, I'll keep working to be better. For you, for myself, and for the world." Elena felt a mixture of emotions: hope, love, and a sense of closure. She knew that David's journey was genuine, but she also knew that her own path was just as important. It wasn't about reuniting with David. It was about ensuring that her love for herself remained intact, regardless of what happened. The story ends not with a reunion, but with a promise. Elena stands on the edge of a new chapter, stronger and wiser than before. David, too, is on a path of redemption, guided by the lessons of love, prejudice, and the fight for equality. The consequences of their choices were profound, but so was the growth that came from facing the truth. Love may not have conquered all, but it had sparked change, real, meaningful change that transcended their relationship and touched the lives of others. As Elena gazed at the horizon, she felt a sense of peace. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was a true one that honored both her love and her dignity. And that, in the end, was more powerful than any illusion of perfect love. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.